On August 6, 1945, the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and 3 days later on Nagasaki ended the brutal Pacific War. The first bomb, named Little Boy, was carried to Hiroshima by the B-29 superfortress Enola Gay. The unescorted bomber flew alone over Japan to the target and obliterated an entire city with just the push of a button. Few events in modern history have generated as much controversy as the decision to use the atomic bomb on human targets. Harry S. Truman, the man who made the decision to use those first two atomic weapons, was still a mystery to most Americans when he became president after the death of Franklin Roosevelt on April 12, 1945. Truman inherited the moral responsibility for the atomic bomb, the job of ending World War II, the management of a faltering alliance with the Soviet Union, and the drafting of American foreign and domestic policy in the dawning post-war world. In the first weeks of his administration, with the war in Europe reaching its end, one of Truman's concerns was the growing rift between the United States and its wartime ally, the Communist Soviet Union. In the coming months, tensions grew in the global turmoil following the end of World War II. Strained relations led to a Cold War that defined domestic culture and U.S. relations with the world in the second half of the 20th century. Truman's decisions during the months and years following World War II spurred 3 generations of global competition with the Soviets and enormous consequences for peoples on every continent. In April 1945, British and American troops closed in on Berlin from the west, while the Soviets slugged their way toward the city in the face of dogged resistance from the east. Hours after assuming the presidency, Truman learned that Stalin was pushing his troops to capture the city ahead of the Americans. With big shoes to fill on the world stage, Truman worked to understand the complicated relationship with the Soviets. FDR had left the Yalta Conference convinced that his hard-won alliance with Stalin would help ensure the Soviets live up to their agreements in Eastern Europe. In his first months in office, Truman shared his predecessor's optimism. In his diaries, he described Stalin as, quote, honest and smart as hell. But briefings with Roosevelt's top military advisors tempered Truman's optimism and raised his distrust of Stalin and the Soviets. Advisors cautioned Truman to avoid appeasing Stalin as he gained control of Eastern Europe. Truman sent top diplomat W. Averell Harriman to Moscow. Harriman's dispatches decried Stalin's, quote, barbarian invasion of Europe. He warned the Soviets that Truman would not stand for communist expansion. Forced to formulate a foreign policy strategy in less than a week, Truman latched on to the strong anti-communist position of Harriman. The growing rivalry between the members of the Grand Alliance heated up as the final battle of the war in Europe took shape around Berlin. By April 1945, the German army was reduced to young boys and old men, and Berlin was in ruins. Still, the fight for the city remained brutal to the end. When the Soviets reached the city first, they symbolically hoisted their red flag on the roof of the ruined Reichstag, while Hitler lay dead of a self-inflicted gunshot in his underground bunker. Germany formally surrendered on May 8, 1945. Even as the German guns finally fell silent, it was clear that peace would be complicated and bitterly contested. While citizens and soldiers rejoiced, political and military leaders remained deeply concerned by news of crumbling relations with Stalin. The Soviets occupied Berlin and controlled a vast territory stretching from the Black Sea to Romania to Poland's Baltic shores. They also controlled a large swath of eastern Germany past Berlin and up the Elbe River. The Allies had agreed at Yalta to partition Germany into occupation zones, but no formal mechanism existed for cooperation between the Soviets, the US, and Great Britain. Tensions grew when the Soviets annexed a huge swath of eastern Poland. In Washington, only 11 days after taking office, Truman faced off with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and accused the Soviets of breaking their agreements to give Poland independence. Stalin responded by firmly maintaining they were only establishing a security zone in Poland and that Soviet interests in Eastern Europe were more important than good relations with America's new president. The leaders of the alliance met for the last time in Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin. On July 15th, Truman and Secretary of State James Burns arrived in Potsdam without a clear understanding of the extent of Stalin's expansionist ambitions, and with the war in Japan entering a pivotal moment. Still hoping for Soviet assistance in subduing the millions of Japanese troops on the Asian mainland, Truman tempered his position on Poland and agreed to the Soviets' occupation of Eastern Europe. The debate about Poland symbolized the brewing ideological Cold War to come. 2 years earlier, at a critical meeting of the alliance at Tehran, Iran, Roosevelt and Churchill had secretly agreed to Stalin's demand that the Allies accept Soviet control of eastern Poland. Unaware of this agreement, Polish resistance leaders organized a massive uprising against the Germans in Warsaw with the assumption that the nearby Red Army would join the fight. In one of the bloodiest events of the war, German troops, crushing the uprising, slaughtered 250,000 civilians, reducing Warsaw to ruins. The Soviets stayed away and allowed Warsaw to fall. Months later, Truman agreed to let the Soviets formally redraw the map of Poland, which was a crushing blow to the Poles. From the perspective of Central Europe, the battle lines of the coming Cold War were clear. The ideological battle between the emerging superpowers would be fought on other people's territory with profound and lasting consequences for those nations. Firebombings of Tokyo in March of 1945 killed more than 100,000 civilians, while desperate fighting at Iwo Jima and Okinawa left tens of thousands of U.S. casualties. Truman had to choose between a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland, with military estimates of death tolls in the millions, or to use the atom bombs. U.S. leaders feared the cost of a full-scale invasion of Japan, since the militarists in Tokyo seemed unwilling to surrender on any terms acceptable to the Allies. At Yalta and Potsdam, Stalin agreed to attack Japanese forces in Northeast Asia 3 months after Germany surrendered. Most of Japan's army was stationed on the Asian mainland. Although Soviet military help would greatly reduce America's burden and casualties, Truman feared that if the Red Army joined the war against Japan, it would support communist forces in China. Given this potential problem, Truman chose to use the atomic bomb. Its use could shock Japanese hardliners into surrender, avoid U.S. casualties, and end the war before the Soviets could move into Japan. Furthermore, the use of the bombs would provide a graphic example of U.S. power in the Soviets' backyard. Aside from the attack on Pearl Harbor and some Japanese incendiary bombs carried by balloon over the Pacific Northwest, the U.S. homeland remained unscathed during World War II. The U.S.'s industrial complex had dramatically expanded, its Navy and Air Force were unmatched, and its president and military leaders had sole possession of the atomic bomb. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was devastated, with entire cities leveled and an estimated 28 million citizens dead. Despite the relative strength of the U.S. compared to the USSR, concerns about the spread of communism in the aftermath of war escalated. American leaders framed the contest as a struggle between Western democracy and a global communist conspiracy led by the Soviet Union. The war unleashed dramatic forces of global change and created conditions for a transnational ideological power struggle. The war irreparably altered the colonial empires of European nations and enabled the rise of revolutionary nationalism in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. All over the world, in countries like India and French Indochina, soon to be known as Vietnam, crumbling colonial control fueled nationalist desires and demands for independence, modernization, and higher quality of life. Even before the war ended, boundaries shifted as diverse peoples searched for ideologies and leadership to enable a new phase of their history. U.S. policymakers pejoratively labeled these mostly non-white developing nations and contested regions the, quote, third world, in contrast to the presumed civility and superiority of the first and second nations. The assumed lack of sophistication, cultural development, and national cohesiveness in former colonies prejudiced critical Cold War decision-making in the coming years, often with disastrous results. At the end of the war, America had a clear military and economic advantage over the Soviets. To succeed in the growing Cold War, however, Truman needed another resource, an appealing ideology to counter communist promises that had gained popularity among those disillusioned by the democratic capitalist model. Many people in former colonies of Western powers viewed the capitalism of their colonizers as the cause of depression, war, and fascism. In the coming decades, the selling of American culture and ideology became an important weapon in the Cold War, spreading American ideals through international marketing of everything from jeans and cars to music and movies, provided the, quote, soft power behind hard-edged Cold War foreign policy. And there was real reason to fear the expansion of communism. By 1947, alarming statistics about the growing popularity of communism across Europe raised concerns that the Soviets would have the balance of power handed to them by nations reeling from the aftermath of war. Between 1935 and 1945, Communist Party membership increased from 17,000 to 70,000 in Greece, from 28,000 to 750,000 in Czechoslovakia, and from 5,000 to 1.7 million in Italy. Much of this rapid growth stemmed from the key anti-Nazi role played by local communists during the war, rather than from admiration of Stalin's policies. Still, there seemed to be evidence that communism was a powerful force in the post-colonial world. Atomic fears raised the stakes of post-war diplomacy and international relations. The chilling possibility of a nuclear World War III had been hanging in the air since the atomic bombing of Japan. In 1946, dramatic demonstrations of the bomb's destructive power in the Bikini Atoll caused global tension. Very early in the atomic age, fear of nuclear war worked its way into American popular culture. The August 1946 publication and serialization of John Hersey's best-selling Hiroshima brought home the reality of nuclear war. The planning and execution of massive nuclear tests in the South Pacific Bikini Islands during Operation Crossroads received more press than any other event in 1946. Wide media coverage of atomic developments and frightening doomsday scenarios made the consequences of atomic warfare more real for the American public even before the Soviets got the bomb. In 1946, Truman needed a clear policy to respond to both real and perceived changes in the global balance of power in the nuclear age. Inspiration for a critical foreign policy plan came from the Soviet expert George F. Kennan. In 1946, he sent his analysis of the post-war Soviet Union from his post in Moscow to Washington in a widely circulated 8,000-word long telegram. In July 1947, Kennan published an even longer version of his pessimistic assessment of the Soviets in the influential journal Foreign Affairs. Kennan's idea, containment, became the foundation of U.S. foreign policy for the next 4 decades. In the U.S., containment spawned a Red Scare. Fear of communism led to restrictions of individual rights and the systemic persecution of diverse groups of American citizens. A series of disturbing events between 1948 and 1950 accomplished Harry Truman's goal to, quote, scare the hell out of the American public. First, the Soviets caused an international crisis when they blockaded Berlin in hopes of gaining control of the divided city and thwarting U.S. efforts to rebuild a powerful West Germany. Between June 1948 and May 1949, the Soviets, locking down all roads leading to the city, forced the first showdown of the Cold War. The U.S. responded with the most remarkable air supply effort in history. For almost a year, U.S. transport planes carried food and coal into the city 24 hours a day. As they flew low over the city, U.S. pilots, earning the nickname the Candy Bombers, took special pleasure in showering the children of Berlin with candy. The Berlin airlift won the hearts of Berliners and humiliated the Soviets, who reopened the city on May 11, 1949. By then, the U.S. had realized its goal of unifying the western zones of Germany into a pro-Western state in opposition to the Soviet-controlled eastern zones. Policymakers had only a few months to enjoy the success in Berlin as the shocking news arrived on August 29, 1949, that the Soviets had successfully tested an atomic bomb. The Soviets' ability to catch up with American technology so rapidly revealed what U.S. leaders had suspected, that communist spies had successfully infiltrated the Manhattan Project. America's monopoly on atomic power was over. In October 1949, China fell to the Communists under the leadership of Mao Zedong. The formation of the Communist People's Republic of China especially disheartened Americans because of their long-standing charitable and missionary aid to the nation and significant diplomatic efforts by General George Marshall to ensure that China would remain free. Marshall spent most of 1946 in China arranging a coalition between the Chinese nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and his communist rivals, led by Mao. Despite Marshall's efforts, the coalition faltered. Chiang's incompetence contrasted with the communists' rising popularity and superior organization. Full-scale civil war broke out in 1947, and by 1949, Mao led a unified China that allied itself with the Soviet Union.
Russia will never know one day of peace in China. Russia will never own China. China will remain free.
But it wasn't to be. Within weeks of the proclamation of the Chinese Communist state, Mao was off to Moscow to sign a pact with the Soviet Union, and other countries in the West slowly started to recognize the new regime in Peking. For the Kremlin leadership in Moscow, developments in China were a great boost. They now had a great Cold War ally. Mao would protect the long Soviet border with Asia, leaving Moscow free to concentrate its military resources in Europe. Mao, for his part, got the benefit of Soviet economic, diplomatic and military protection, while he established control of his vast country. It didn't take long. The first of the rural 5-year plans was put into force, and the Communist Party bureaucracy took hold of the countryside, transforming society. But more than that, October the 1st, 1949, was the day that set the pattern of superpower politics for a generation.
Americans worried that the new alliance between Stalin and Mao threatened to spread communism more widely in Asia. All these events in 1949 raised U.S. fears and seemed to confirm the basic premise of the Truman Doctrine, that communist revolutionaries threatened freedom around the globe. Any doubts about a world communist conspiracy faded with the news of a communist North Korean invasion of South Korea on June 25, 1950. The North Korean attack turned the Cold War hot. In a limited proxy or brushfire war, distant rivals served as substitutes for the US and Soviets, who stood behind or beside them. In Korea, this stance was put to the test. At the close of World War II, the Soviets and Americans agreed to the temporary North-South division of Korea, a Japanese colony since the early 20th century. The US and Soviets agreed to divide Korea into occupation zones at the 38th parallel. Northern Korea had strategic importance for the Soviets, who considered the peninsula key to blocking future Japanese influence in the region and a counterweight to continued U.S. occupation of Japan. Between 1945 and 1950, the Soviets sponsored the creation in the north of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea under Kim Il-sung. The United States backed a separate government in the south, the Republic of Korea, headed by the conservative nationalist Syngman Rhee, who had lived in the U.S. for decades. Both of these new states experienced political insecurity and violence, with an estimated 100,000 people killed during constant internal struggles. The rivalry between the North and South intensified throughout the late 1940s. Both shared much in common, despite their divergent political views. Repressive, autocratic leaders controlled both sections of divided Korea, and both were willing to use violence against their own people and expend massive resources on the military to prevent unification on any terms but their own. In a precedent-setting decision, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff concluded as early as 1947 that Korea had little strategic value to the U.S., but abandoning the unstable South Korean regime would almost certainly lead to war between the U.S.-supported South and the Soviet-supported North. By 1950, U.S. leaders had growing concerns that Communist China would join the fight as well. Under the logic of containment, this potential spread of communism was unacceptable, even if it meant supporting South Korea, a repressive, malfunctioning government in a country known to few Americans with no significant strategic value. On June 25, 1950, the Soviet-supplied North Korean army launched a large-scale invasion across the 38th parallel. The well-organized assault drove quickly through South Korea and into the capital city of Seoul, forcing the U.S.-backed government to flee.
On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea.
As the B-52s began to bomb North Korean positions in the south, it was clear that for the first time the Western Allies were on a collision course with the Communist bloc. The United Nations had passed a resolution condemning the North Korean attack as an act of aggression and called on them to withdraw to the 38th parallel. It was also clear that they were going to do no such thing. So the scene was set for a war between North and South, with the North supplied by China with tacit backing from the Soviet Union, and the South supported by the United States and its allies, and sanctioned by the United Nations. And that, for nearly 18 months, was how it transpired.
2 days after the invasion, the United Nations Security Council, with the Soviets absent so they could not veto the move, met and voted to authorize a US-led coalition of forces to push the communists back across the 38th parallel. Truman named General Douglas MacArthur, chief of the American occupation force in Japan, as U.S. UN theater commander in Korea. From its onset, the Korean War tested not only U.S. Cold War foreign policy, but also the ability of the UN to create coalitions of supporters willing to fight for collective, rather than national goals. During the conflict, 17 UN member nations from 4 continents sent troops to Korea, but U.S. troops far outnumbered all other nations combined. After North Korean forces pushed coalition troops to a small foothold in South Korea, MacArthur staged a dramatic counterattack at Incheon on the northwestern coast of South Korea on September 15, 1950. Pushing rapidly across the peninsula and liberated Seoul, U.S. and UN troops drove hundreds of thousands of North Korean troops north and won back the south in one sustained assault. This surprisingly easy victory inspired both Truman and MacArthur to expand the war. Instead of simply restoring South Korea, the U.S. announced a new goal, destroying the North Korean regime and unifying the country under Ri. In just a few weeks, the coalition reached the northern capital of Pyongyang and seemed poised to retake the entire country. In the flush of apparent victory, both Truman and MacArthur ignored Chinese warnings that its forces would intervene to defend North Korea, especially if U.S. troops approached the Yalu River that separated Korea from China's industrial heartland in Manchuria. MacArthur's forceful personality convinced Truman that China was bluffing and that both the president and general would share in the glory of rolling back communism. When 250,000 Chinese troops swarmed across the border and quickly pushed the U.S. all the way back to the 38th parallel, that assumption was dramatically proved wrong. With U.S. troops in retreat, MacArthur and Truman accused each other of incompetence and political posturing. In April 1951, Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination. The 38th parallel was the focal point of 3 more years of protracted and bloody fighting with no decisive objective other than holding the line. The demilitarized zone, otherwise known as the DMZ or No Man's Land splitting Korea at the 38th parallel, became a Cold War icon, a symbol of stalemate and a persistent reminder that proxy wars could lead to seemingly infinite conflict.
Okay, so we got our freedom, but management's lousing up everything.
Labor is at fault. It's ruining the country.
My constituents, as your elected representative, I can assure you Labor's right, management's right. I'm strictly neutral.
Labor, management, politicians, phooey. They can't tell corn from oats.
Wait, take the money out of my pocket.
Hurry, step right up, folks. Here's the answer to your problems. Dr. Utopia's sensational new discovery, ism. Ism will cure any ailment of the body politic. It's terrific. It's tremendous. Once you swallow the contents of this bottle, you'll have the bountiful benefit of higher wages, shorter hours, and security. Enormous profits, no strikes. Remember, you're the big boss. Government control, no worry about votes. Name your own salary. Bigger crops, lower costs. Why, ism even makes the weather perfect every day. And now then, because we are introducing this amazing item for the first time in this country, it isn't going to cost you 1 cent. All you have to do is sign this little scrap of paper, and you get your bottle absolutely free.
I hereby turn over to ISM Incorporated everything I have, including my freedom and the freedom of my children and my children's children, in return for which said ism promises to take care of me forever.
Cold War anxieties seemed at odds with rising domestic prosperity in the aftermath of World War II, as programs like the GI Bill and Truman's Fair Deal created avenues to middle-class status for many Americans. The Cold War fostered unprecedented economic growth in global capitalism. Military spending on new technologies led to advances in domestic production and consumer goods. These twin engines of economic growth created an extended period of domestic prosperity and more widely spread affluence than at any other time in American history.
Each returning serviceman will get his job back when this war is won. And you women and girls will go home, back to being housewives and mothers again, as you promised to do when you came to work for us. If all industries would adopt this simple policy of taking care of their own employees, there would be no serious post-war problem of unemployed.
Fine. Yes, I'd love to. Thanks, Gene. I'll be there. 2:00. Goodbye. You know, 3 weeks ago, I couldn't have accepted that invitation. Like so many people these days, we live in the suburbs, and Dave needs the car every day for business. When he was gone, I was practically a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't get out to see my friends, couldn't take part in PTA activities. I couldn't even shop when I wanted to. I had to wait till Thursday night after Dave brought the car home. But that's all changed now.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America's asking you to call. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA. America's the greatest land of all. On a highway or a road along a levee. Performance is sweeter, nothing can beat her. Life is completer in a Chevy. So make a date today to see the USA. See it in your Chevrolet.
Traveling east, traveling west, wherever you go, Chevy service is best. Southward or north, near place or far, there's a Chevrolet dealer for your Chevrolet car.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. The Rockies way out west are calling you. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA, where fields of golden wheat pass and review. Whether traveling light or with a load that's heavy, performance is sweeter, nothing can beat her. Life is completer in a Chevy. So make a date today to see the USA and see it in your Chevrolet.
For some of the generation who came of age during the 16 years of global economic depression and war, there finally seemed reason to hope for a brighter future. Those Americans who supported the agenda of the New Deal saw the post-war boom as an opportunity to expand the scope and reach of social welfare programs. For soldiers who benefited from education and preferential hiring policies, part and parcel of the GI Bill and Fair Deal, these advantages often came at the expense of their wives, sisters, and mothers. In the years following the war, women were expected to move from their wartime identity as heroic Rosie the Riveters back to traditional roles as wives at home. Lower income and minority women were forced back to the lower paying, limiting jobs they had held before the war. Many women resisted this trend, but employers, with support from the government, required most to leave lucrative jobs and abandon hard-earned skills. During the war, the percentage of married women and mothers entering the workforce had increased from 13.9% to 22.5% and 7.8% to 12.1% respectively. Wartime polls showed that between 60% and 80% of these women wanted to keep their jobs when the war ended. But when the war actually ended, women workers faced pressure from a new wave of government propaganda, encouraging them to hand their jobs back to men. The systemic removal of women from the industrial workforce was more than a practical response to the return of male vets. It became a Cold War imperative. Government Cold War propaganda stressed that American women could best fight the communist ideological menace by being homemakers. Comparisons between women's work in the Soviet Union and women's work in the U.S. became important points of differentiation for the two systems. The Soviets celebrated women workers as symbols of socialist equality. American politicians pointed to Soviet women workers as an example of the backward communist system that required all to slave away in service of the state. Images of well-dressed American housewives, surrounded by new appliances, became standard U.S. propaganda tools. Globally, the U.S. and USSR fought for the hearts and minds of developing world women through competing organizations. The UN-supported International Council for Women advocated for democracy and freedom for women and children. The Soviet-backed Women's International Democratic Federation supported nationalism and colonial independence in the fight against fascism and racial discrimination around the globe. In the international arena, the WIDF's pro-nationalist message had great appeal, while the ICW could point to the rising standard of living for women in America and U.S.-occupied Germany and Japan as evidence of the benefits of capitalism. Following World War II, the availability of millions of cheap window unit air conditioners enabled places like scorching Phoenix, Arizona to attract business and people. Retirees and winter-weary migrants moved in record numbers from the North and Midwest to the Sun Belt. Migrant workers moving north from Latin America through the U.S. ensured a supply of cheap labor. Libertarian-leaning Western state governments allowed lax environmental standards, limited regulation, and low taxation for entrepreneurs and companies looking to build on the industrialization of the war. Ongoing internal migrations of African Americans to the urban north played a major role in changing the demographic character of American cities and industries. Renewed migrations of Mexicans north into the American Southwest built on long-established patterns but surpassed older trends in both numbers and reach. Across the country, suburban growth fueled by these migrations and the GI Bill caused fundamental changes in American life. Finally, millions of Americans took to the road on seasonal migrations to national parks, historic sites, and vacation spots. These leisure travelers elevated tourism to one of the most important sectors of the post-war economy. The entire U.S. experienced significant demographic shifts during and after World War II, but the newly industrialized American West and South saw the greatest changes. Both regions benefited from the war mobilization that redistributed tens of millions of soldiers and support staff and billions of dollars to massive new military installations in these regions. In pre-war 1939, the U.S. maintained a standing army of only 200,000 men. By 1949, that number had increased to more than 8 million men in the Army alone, and 12 million in the combined armed forces. This increase resulted in the most significant federally organized movement of people and resources in U.S. history. The U.S. Air Force alone required the construction of 500 new airfields and support facilities to build and service over 70,000 aircraft. Military leaders favored the South and West as locations for wartime mobilization for the region's warm weather, clear skies, and wide open spaces. Air bases were built in the desert Southwest where the climate was perfect for both training and storage, but the South got the lion's share of new air bases. Plentiful cheap labor and land combined with powerful Southern politicians help explain the clustering of air bases throughout the Southeast. The demographic and economic impact in areas surrounding military bases was immediate. Sleepy small towns such as Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Killeen, Texas, saw their populations double or more in a matter of months, from 50,000 to 100,000 in Fayetteville, and 1,100 to almost 7,000 in Killeen. Cold War imperatives ensured that the continued growth of the military-industrial complex would continue unimpeded. Racial segregation ensured that white workers benefited from federal opportunities in the South, while black workers, including veterans, suffered from high rates of unemployment. White Southern politicians used their Cold War political influence to garner a large share of federal programs. At the same time, they maintained, and even expanded in some cases, the Jim Crow system to make sure that the South played by its own rules, even as military and economic developments brought the region more closely into the fold of the nation, and the globe for that matter. The military-driven industrialization of the Sun Belt dramatically expanded the political and cultural importance of these regions.
A mass migration was underway from the crowded cities to the new suburbs. At Levittown in New York, they completed 40 houses a day and filmed one going up. The first supermarkets were opening up in the 1950s, changing the way people shopped. A family could now find everything they needed and more under one roof. To Europeans, only just ending rationing, the American abundance seemed beyond their reach. And the gap was huge. The average American's income was twice as high as the British workers and 4 times as high as the Italians. They could buy a range of goods unknown in Europe.
For families who had endured almost 2 decades of hardship, the family vacation became the ultimate expression of freedom and affluence. Automakers quickly retooled factories from military to domestic production and promoted ownership and travel. Along with the single-family home, car ownership marked a family's successful rise to the middle class, and personal mobility became a symbol of American freedom during the Cold War. Manufacturers promoted auto travel with catchy ad campaigns such as "See the USA in your Chevrolet." Americans responded by purchasing cars in unprecedented numbers. Cold War patriotism inspired widespread interest in historic sites and boosted efforts to preserve America's heritage. The Gettysburg Historic Battlefield and other iconic historic sites sprouted gateway villages with miles of nearby motels catering to a new breed of heritage tourist. Businesses recognized the seemingly unlimited economic opportunities presented by an expanding middle class obsessed with travel and recreation. Companies like Ford capitalized on the popularity of outdoor recreation with advertising campaigns showing their vehicles loaded with camping gear and parked alongside a lake or in a mountain meadow. Cigarette companies eager to keep wartime smokers buying at home shifted from advertising that depicted dapper smokers in urban settings to ads showing rugged men and outdoorsy women enjoying a smoke around the campfire. Between the end of the war and the mid-1950s, wartime boosted products and technologies moved into the general marketplace with far-reaching consequences for American culture and economy. For those who could afford it, the vacation retreat to the slopes, the woods, or the beach provided a welcome distraction from Cold War anxieties. But not all shared equally in such relief. Carefully monitored visitor statistics in the national parks showed that less than 1% of tourists were African Americans, and even in the Southwest, the numbers for Hispanics were equally low. In the 1950s, the world of recreation travel was almost exclusively white. During World War II, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People launched a widely publicized Double V campaign against the twin evils of fascism and racism. It was their hope that the racism of the Nazis would open American eyes to inequality at home. When Harry Truman became president, he brought an ambivalence about race not uncommon to politicians of his day. Despite personal uncertainties about racial equality, however, Truman made civil rights part of his domestic agenda at great political cost. In 1946, Truman established the President's Committee on Civil Rights and supported its controversial 1947 report to secure these rights. Truman's most significant civil rights achievement was the desegregation of the military.
In 1941, some of the finest American fighter pilots took on the fight for a double victory. against oppression abroad and racism at home. They call themselves Red Tails.
We're as patriotic as anybody else. We wanted our chance to prove that we could do something.
Your nation calls on you to die for your country, and you can't even sit down in a restaurant. It's not a pleasant feeling when you look and think, what am I volunteering to die for?
I really didn't care whether it was segregated or not. I wanted to fly.
Admission into the cadet training program required at least 2 years of college, at a time when fewer than 1% of African Americans had a college degree. Academically, they truly were the best of the best. By the end of World War II, the Red Tails had flown more than 1,500 missions, shooting down a total of 112 enemy aircraft, including Nazi Germany's first jet fighters.
I saw these streaks coming. Instead of going this way, I went down, turned the plane upside down, went down under the bombers, and I caught one of the jets just as he was coming in to shoot down the B-17.
Back home in America, top brass personally decorated the group's pilots.
It was a time in history we should be very proud of. We set the star very, very high for anybody who's following us. We changed the world.
The double victory had yet to be won.
At home and abroad, American leaders reinforced the notion that the Cold War was a fight to protect the free world. At the same time, during the 1940s and 1950s, the repressive and violent racism of the South and institutional racism throughout the nation contradicted U.S. foreign policy rhetoric. Conservative citizens groups and politicians justified racism by equating civil rights with radical liberalism and communism. Despite these strident voices, a slowly growing national consensus about the importance of civil rights in the fight against the world communist conspiracy emerged in the post-war years. For many white Americans, pragmatic responses to racial inequality grew into genuine humanitarian concerns as they learned more about their fellow African American citizens from their war experiences and from the national media spotlight thrown on exceptional African American individuals such as Jackie Roosevelt Robinson. When Robinson walked on the field wearing a Dodgers uniform, he took center stage in an early battle to win American hearts and minds in the battle against racism. Other black players soon followed Robinson into the major leagues. In the coming years, African Americans used sports and entertainment to cross the color line and win the admiration of white fans who often became allies in the fight for racial equality. For African Americans, the oppressive ironies of the Cold War South seemed unbearable. African Americans had served the U.S. with great distinction during World War II. They were treated as heroes in France and other liberated countries where, often for the first time in their lives, they were identified as Americans rather than simply blacks. Southern African Americans fought for freedom during World War II, knowing freedom at home only as an ideal never fully realized. Despite wartime civil rights efforts like the Double V campaign, veterans came home to a segregated Southern power structure as racist as the one they had left. Revelations of Nazi racism and the Holocaust drew global attention to the brutal realities of racial hatred in all its forms. In the American South, however, black veterans discovered that civil rights activists were branded as subversives in the Southern media, linked with communism, hounded by FBI and other federal officials, and even murdered by fellow Americans. Stories of black veterans being beaten, gunned down, or lynched after simply attempting to register to vote became international news. Veterans like Medgar and Charles Evers, who spoke out about the absurdity and moral perversion of racism in a country fighting for global freedom, faced coercion and violence from all levels of Southern authorities and the resurgent Ku Klux Klan. Medgar Evers repeatedly tried to register to vote, only to be chased by a violent mob threatening death. Stories like these disturbed a growing number of white Americans while providing a powerful ammunition to the Soviets and anti-American forces around the globe. In the early years of the Cold War, civil rights was part of a global movement of oppressed people searching for freedom in a post-colonial world. American racism posed a serious problem for Cold War efforts to win the loyalty of the non-white Third World. Global ideological competition with the Soviet Union required America's political leaders to demonstrate the appeal of American life in opposition to the communist system. The existence of Jim Crow put America at a decided disadvantage, forcing reluctant national leaders to take a stand against segregation in the next decade in the name of national security, if not decency and respect. The treatment of African Americans during World War II and the early Cold War demonstrated to the world the nature and extent of American racism. Within the U.S., a migration of African Americans during and after the war forced millions of Americans into closer contact with blacks and made it increasingly difficult to think of racism as simply a Southern issue. Between 1946 and the 1960s, many African American Southerners, responding to disheartening post-war racism, fled the South for new opportunities in booming cities of the North and West. But practical concerns also prompted migration. The perfection of a mechanical cotton picker in 1944 effectively ended the sharecropping system that had for so long locked a large percentage of Southern blacks into a cycle of poverty and debt. Outmigrations toward wartime opportunities in places like the West also undermined the system. Despite wartime movement and a major migration in the earlier part of the century, 77% of African Americans still lived in the South at the beginning of World War II. 49% of those lived in the rural South. By 1970, only half of America's African Americans lived in the South. The rest were concentrated in urban areas in the North and West. In the 1940s, the demographic character of cities and industries changed, and angry whites worried about the effect of race and cheap black labor on the character of their communities. Often they responded with violence. In the spring of 1943, race riots in Harlem killed 5 people, injured 400, and caused millions in damage. Similar riots in Detroit led to significant violence, creating lasting racial tensions in the city that came to represent the best and worst possibilities of the black migration. In many cases, white Southern workers who had migrated north to work in war industry clashed with blacks who did the same. Across the nation, white neighborhoods responded with racial covenants or redlining of cities, creating a de facto system of segregation enforced by markets, if not by law. But between 1945 and 1952, progress in civil rights built a foundation for dramatic expansion of the movement that would occur in the 1950s and 1960s, when civil rights moved to the center of American politics and became part of a broader struggle to redefine American culture and values.
Me and my wife run all over town. Everywhere we go, the people would turn us down, Lord, and the bourgeois down. He's the bourgeois down. I got the bourgeois blues, gonna spreading years all around. Me and Martin, we was standing upstairs. I heard a white man say, I don't want no niggas up there, Lord, he's a bourgeois man. He's bourgeois town. I got the bourgeois blues gonna spread in years all around. Home of the brave, land of the free. I don't want to be mistreated by no bourgeoisie, Lord, in a bourgeois town. It's a bourgeois town. I got the bourgeois blues are gonna spread the news all around. Everywhere we go, the colored people will turn us down, Lord, in a bourgeois town. It's a bourgeois town. I got the bourgeois blues, I'm gonna spread in years all around. the white folks in Washington, they know how. Chunk of color man, a nigga just to see him bow, Lord, it's a bourgeois town. It's a bourgeois town. I got the bourgeois blues, I'm gonna let in use early round. Tell all the colored folks to listen to me. Don't try to buy no home in Washington, D.C., cause it's a bourgeois town. It's a bourgeois town. I got the bourgeois blues and I'm so gonna spread the news.